Hi everyone, good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar about functional expenses and the overhead myth in regard to nonprofit organizations. I'm April Kushner. I'm a partner here at Sachs in our nonprofit practice, and I'm happy to be presenting this to you today. I'm joined here today with Lauren Frary and Adam Holzberg. Lauren is our Director of Strategic Business Transformation, and Adam Holzberg is a partner in our not-for-profit practice as well. Lauren, you want to say hello to everyone?
Good morning, everyone. So happy to be here with April and Adam to present this webinar. I think it's a very timely webinar in terms of our nonprofits and concerns about functional expenses and funding. So I hope you take away a few nuggets of information from us.
Everyone, thanks for joining us this morning. This is a very hotly debated topic, so hopefully you find it all very interesting.
Okay, all right, so we're going to dive in here a little bit about the functional expenses and the technical side. We're going to bring you about a little bit about the overhead myth. So if you don't know what the overhead myth is, Adam's going to be telling you exactly what it is, and Lauren's going to be telling us some trends in funding and kind of bring it all together for you. If you have any questions, we do have a question box. You can drop them in there and we'll address some questions at the end of the webinar. And this webinar is being recorded. So as an attendee and anyone who is registered, you will get a copy of this recording so you can watch it at a future date. So let's just jump in here. So the functional expense schedule for nonprofit organizations, the accounting guidance requires that nonprofits have this. You're required to have your expenses in their natural classification as well as by their functional classification. So natural classification we know is salaries, taxes, rent, utilities, office supplies, things like that. And functional expenses, that's in the categories of program services and supporting activities. Supporting activities have a few categories below there. So that includes your management and general activities, also known as your G&A. There's fundraising activities, and then there's membership development activities as well. So program services is going to be your direct program costs. So they are directly related to your mission and directly tied to those programs. Of course, we all know that you can't directly deliver your programs without the supporting services. So I like to call them the supporting activities, not just the G&A, right? Because they support those programs. So these are really your three categories here of supporting activities for a nonprofit organization. And the whole reason why this functional expense schedule is applicable to nonprofits is to really help donors, creditors, and other users in assessing the nonprofit's service efforts and how it uses its resources. So I did take those words directly from the accounting guidance about the purpose of this schedule, but we know that there's really much more to assessing a nonprofit's service efforts and how it uses its resources. So on the next page here, this is the management and general activities. This is what's required to be included in management in general or G&A. So there is accounting guidance. This list is not all inclusive, but it is a lot of the key things that I think we see on a lot of our nonprofit organizations. So something like oversight of the program, business management, general record keeping and payroll, budgeting, financing, including unallocated interest costs, soliciting funds other than contributions and membership dues, so that includes advertising costs, administering government, foundation, or similar contracts, including billing and collecting fees and grant and contract financial reporting. So an example of that would be if you have a grant that's pretty significant and within your budget, you're allocated an accounting staff person to be able to administer that contract. That would fall under that category. Producing annual reports, employee benefits management and human resources, And the catch-all here is all other management and administrative except for direct conduct of program services. So there is that little catch-all there. So the things that we see most often on our clients is exactly these things on this list. If you are engaged in doing budgeting for the organization, if you are in the CFO or controller role, you're budgeting, any general record keeping and payroll, those functions are considered to be supporting activities. And the thought would be is that you could still run your programs without doing the record keeping. You'd still be able to deliver your mission, deliver your services, carry out your programs if you didn't have that record keeping. But we all know that you have to have that. It's part of the supporting services to the program. So you can't have your programs run successfully without these supporting services and without these G&A items. Things like producing your annual reports, the HR function and employee benefits management. These are all services and time that you spend that should be allocated to the G&A column when you look at a functional expense schedule. And so on the next page, there are some different ways to present the functional expenses in the financial statements. And again, this is from the accounting guidance. You've got a statement of functional expenses. I think this is what we see most often. You have on a financial statement for a nonprofit organization, your statement of financial position. You've got your statement of activities. And then you also have a statement of functional expenses, because usually there's a lot of detail on there. Some organizations like to break out program, G&A, and fundraising, and some organizations like to break out multiple programs. So that schedule can be a bit large, which is why it's very common to have a separate statement of functional expenses in the financial statements. The footnote to the financial statements is also an option to present this. So if you didn't have as much detail, you wanted to just show program, G&A, fundraising, and your totals, you could do this also in a footnote to the financials in a little table. And according to the accounting guidance, there are also some disclosures required in the footnotes as to how expenses are allocated and what methodologies are used by management. So I wanted to give an example because you might be thinking, well, how many different methodologies could there really be in terms of allocating my costs? And so I wanted to give you an example here. I came across this on some clients. And here's an example of different ways to allocate employee benefits. So a lot of times you start with allocating the payroll. So you perform a payroll allocation. Once the payroll allocation percentages are complete, you could apply the same percentages to the total employee benefits. That would give you similar percentages and help you allocate your total employee benefits. Another way, I had a client that did it this way, and again, it's just a difference in methodologies. They performed an analysis by person, and they concluded that some of the staff who would be 100% allocated to G&A for salary, such as a CFO or an HR director, they do not participate in the health benefit plan. So therefore, they do the allocation here by person, which would then yield a different percentage than the first method where you used your salaries as a basis for allocating your benefits. So I think this is a really good example here to show you how there can be different methodologies from organization to organization, and it's really just management's estimate and their methodology of how they're going to allocate expenses for the organization. And so nonprofits file Form IRS Form 990. There is a functional expense allocation on there as well, in addition to the financial statements. And it also reports the fundraising expenses annually to the IRS. There are some slight differences between the GAAP reporting for the financial statements and the IRS Form 990. And then the functional expense schedule is required to be prepared by management. It's considered to be an estimate made by management. And so as a nonprofit organization, if you're unsure about the accounting guidance, you can consult with your accountants and your auditors regarding what the appropriate accounting guidance is to apply to their allocations. So I had that list of all the things that are required to be part of GNA. That's a list that you'd want to refer to when you're preparing your functional expense allocation. And really when you're preparing it, it's an estimate. So you're going to want to go through your salaries, your personnel, have an idea of where you're spending your time, where you're spending your efforts, and be able to go down each of those main categories and apply an allocation percentage. So when you have a square footage and you're looking at your rent expense of which programs are using your locations, there's all different methodologies that you'd be able to use there. And so one of the most highly asked questions on our next slide is, how do my percentages compare to other organizations? And so this is one of our most highly asked questions. For every board meeting we go to, we present the functional expenses, we mention that it's an estimate, and it's always asked, how do we compare? Because I guess as auditors, we see the numbers a lot for a lot of different organizations. And so although you are all nonprofit organizations, your missions are very different, your programs are all very different, and your funding is very different. So as an organization, depending what your business model is and what you do as an organization, you're going to see very different percentages across the board for nonprofits. Some organizations are heavily funded through cost reimbursement grants or through fee-for-service grants, and some organizations rely solely on individual and private contributions and grants. So on the next slide, I wanted to show you an example of how not-for-profit organizations can really differ from one another and the percentages that you would see here. Okay. All right, so we've taken a sample here of 6 organizations. There are public websites out there where you can obtain any organization's 990 and be able to see their financial information. So that's where a lot of this was derived from, straight from the 990s that are public information for your donors. So we have 6 organizations here that we've compared for you, so you can see how drastically different they are from one another. So not-for-profit A and B are in the same sector, serving similar populations, but in different geographic locations, and they are primarily funded through government grants. And you'll see here that A and B are similar size organizations in terms of revenue, because we thought we would give you the size of the organizations here. And you'll see that their percentages are a little different, that one organization has 91% as their program percentage, and the other one is 83%. We mentioned here too that not-for-profit B has a separate foundation for fundraising. So you'll see that one organization has some fundraising and one organization is, at 0%. And again, these are all rounded, so there may be some fundraising in there, but not enough to hit over that 0% number. Not-for-profit C is a membership organization. So as a nonprofit, their structure is a little different. They're $2 million in revenue, and you'll see that the program percentage is 76%, and they have a lot more in fundraising. Not-for-profit D is an organization that's funded through a thrift shop and contributions from the public. There is no government grants on that organization. And it also uses a direct mailing service for its individual contributions. So you'll see a very heavy amount in the fundraising category. Not-for-profit E is a healthcare organization, heavily funded through grants, insurance, and private pay. And not-for-profit F is a school funded through grants for low-income students and also funded through private pay. So you'll see here a lot of different percentages among all of the organizations here. So even though they're all nonprofits, they all have some different percentages here. Actually, Alex, can you go back one more? Thank you. So, in regard to the percentages, Adam and Lauren, I don't know too if you see anything else here that you'd want to highlight to our audience in terms of the percentages.
Yeah, I think it really highlights how every nonprofit is so different. So we say nonprofit, but it's such an umbrella term for such a wide range of different kind of organizations. And you see it here. I mean, if you're dependent on getting new grants every year from the public, you're gonna have fundraising expenses. You have to go out there and raise more money every year. If you're dependent on more government funding, which is more recurring, or program service fees like healthcare and school over tuition, you're probably not fundraising as much. So you're gonna be very different. So everyone wants to compare themselves to other nonprofits, but it's such a tough question to really answer because no one nonprofit is really the same.
I would also add that I think funders are starting to kind of catch on to the idea that these percentages are less relevant, and program effectiveness and efficiency and impact on communities is emerging as really the more effective way to look at nonprofits and judge them in terms of funding priorities. So, and we will talk, Adam and I will both talk about that in a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I thought it was interesting, like the not-for-profits, E and F, one is funded through grants, insurance, private pay, and the school is also getting money for low-income students in private pay. So their funding streams for these two organizations are both considered program service fees, or fee for service. And so you can see they're both under $10 million in size, and their percentages are very different. The school is very lean because I think you have a lot of staff and teachers, not as much on the back end side. And so I think they seem very lean with 93% in their program expenses. And the other organization, the healthcare organization, very different. You see 19% in G&A. Similar funding models, I think, on those two, but very different percentages. Same with
which makes sense. Healthcare is going to have a lot of back office support for billing. It's going to need that support, which leads to higher G&A expenses, which goes into more. Every nonprofit's so different from one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And the one I always find too, the most fascinating on here is Organization D. Because they use a direct mailing service for individual contributions, their fundraising percentage is very high. So it depends which number you're really looking at. If you look at program, you say 61%, wow, that's low. But when you look at G&A and it's only 7%, you say, wow, that's actually, pretty in line with the averages. It's not extremely high for G&A, but it's their fundraising model. For them, I would imagine, they market to people and say, we're not taking any government grants. We're really funded truly through the public and all of their individual contributions. So all different funding models that you can see here for these 6 not-for-profit organizations. So even some of them that are in the same sector and have similar business models, again, it's an estimate. It's an estimate of where time and effort is being spent within the organization. So I thought this was a really good comparison for everyone. So you could see, how they differ from one another. So Adam now is going to go over the overhead myth with you. So tell you pretty much what it is. So if you hadn't heard of the term before, he's going to explain it to us.
All right, thanks, April. Thanks for putting the fun and functional. Sorry, everyone. I make a little dad joke there. 2 little kids, so just practicing. So the overhead myth. So just taking a step back for a second. So as we kind of mentioned before, there are a lot of different kind of nonprofits. Whether it's a type of nonprofit, whether it's the mission or the cause, whether it's a funding source, they're all very different. And donors are out there looking to contribute to different nonprofits, and it's very hard to get that apples to apples comparison. So basically what has kind of come about is to get that apples to apples comparison, this whole overhead idea has come about, and this has been largely pushed by charity watchdogs and others of the like, as a means for donors to get a sense of how effective is a nonprofit. And that effectiveness is really being dictated by what the overhead percentage is. The lower the overhead percentage, that based on this measurement means that that nonprofit is more effective than another one, and now allow that nonprofit to, go out and potentially solicit more donations compared to someone else who maybe has a higher overhead ratio. Now the downside of that, the dark side of that, is now overhead has a negative stigma to it. Overhead is now a dirty word for a nonprofit. As contributions, there's only so much out there. Nonprofits are all fighting over the same pool of donations. And if donors are looking from an overhead standpoint to make donation decisions, then the goal then is get overhead low. But that has a lot of serious impacts to the nonprofit. So that's kind of how this whole idea really came about. As April went over the functional expenses, is really showing how the nonprofits are allocating the resources between program and overhead spending. And nonprofits know that donors are looking for this. So you'll see a lot of promotional materials out there where nonprofits may say, for every dollar you donate, 90 cents is going to the cause or to the mission as a means to solicit more donations. What all that is really doing, though, is being more this idea that overhead is a negative, it's a bad thing, just being more into that stigma. So on the next slide, so what this ultimately has done is it's created a lot of unrealistic expectations from donors on how much money it really takes to run an organization. Donors have it in their heads now that nonprofits, well, once again, overhead is a bad thing, so they want low overhead when they're making donation decisions. And that's kind of led into nonprofits kind of feeding into that, trying to show low overhead, and just creating further those unrealistic expectations. You see that a lot with what the grants are covering. So at the high end, grants are really covering, at most 10 to 15% of an organization's overhead, which is really just well below the amount they really need to really thrive. There was actually a survey done of foundations, and 80% of the survey foundations admitted that they know the overhead rates they're in their grants are too low, but still they still go ahead and provide those overhead rates. So what this really has done by creating this whole negative stigma on overhead and kind of feeding to these expectations that overhead needs to be low is create what's been coined the nonprofit starvation cycle. And this is kind of really the dark side of the overhead myth. So on the next slide, this is the starvation cycle. So really simply, funders have these unrealistic expectations. They believe overhead should be low. That's what they've all been, told, that nonprofits need to keep their overhead as low as possible. We all want to see, more of donations going to the cause, and less, to fundraising, for instance, which is really not how it should work. So nonprofits now feel the need, the pressure to conform to that. That recently Giving USA came out with their report that, donations, contributions in the prior year went down. So the pool shrunk on the amount of money out there. And as all nonprofits are competing for this, pool of money, and if donors are looking from an overhead standpoint, then overhead needs to be kept low to really compete in that market. So what happens then is nonprofits begin to neglect their infrastructure primarily. And what this really does is it really just harms the nonprofit, and creates nonprofits to become ineffective. And that's really what the end result of all this is. So the whole idea of the overhead myth is that this is really showing how effective a nonprofit is, but the end result of that is that it really just creates an ineffective nonprofit. So they forego the infrastructure. They're not investing in technology, which is really important right now. They're not getting the right reporting they need to show program outcomes. They're potentially not training staff the best way they could, which then creates poor quality of service. They're probably understaffed, underpaid. It is a whole downward spiral. So what it's really doing is it's creating a death spiral of the nonprofit, because now the nonprofit has forcibly created a lower overhead ratio, which then further feeds into the funders saying, oh, look, the nonprofits do have low overhead ratios, which then goes right through the cycle again. The nonprofits continue to feel the pressure to conform to that, continue to neglect investing in themselves, and just goes around and around in this this cycle. So is this really true though? I mean, that's really the question. So on the next slide, there was actually a study done back in 2018 on the overhead myth, more or less. It was to see really how truly effective were nonprofits when looking at the program and overhead spending. Is this really the right measurement to be using from a donation strategy standpoint? So university partnered with Habitat for Humanity. Habitat has local affiliates nationwide, roughly 400 or so. So the university received all their operational and financial data to really measure their efficiencies. So in the study, they used two different efficiency measurements that could incorporate the outcomes of the nonprofit, the spending. And by using one nonprofit, Habitat, the outcomes are all going to be very similar. As the issue and the kind of how this whole came about is how difficult it is really to compare different nonprofits. So in this case, they used one nonprofit, just had a nationwide presence, and they were looking from an efficiency standpoint. So using these measurements, they which already exist but typically used for other industries, they found out that the two efficiency measurements they used were highly correlated, meaning that if one was highly efficient in one, they're also highly efficient in the other one. So they're pretty close to one another. And what they found was, looking at these different Habitat affiliates, the ones who are the most effective actually have very high overhead ratios. One was 32%, and for the other measurement, it was 36%. If you were to go out to the public with those ratios, you would probably get, a side eye on that one, because how high the overhead ratios are and how people are so primed to think that overhead needs to be, 20% or lower, for instance. So it's much higher than what, the typical amount you expect to see from the public. But those were considered the most effective of affiliates, even despite those high overhead ratios, which just goes to show that if a nonprofit is investing in themselves, investing in that infrastructure that they need to do, that they could take that dollar being donated and get a much further result than if they were spending all their money into the program. Because what they found was the affiliates with the very low overhead ratios were actually ranked very low from an efficiency standpoint. So what, in the end, what the study showed is that this whole idea of overhead spending as the end-all be-all to make donation strategies is incredibly inaccurate. That this is not measuring efficiency. All it's really doing in the end is really creating greater inefficiencies. So this is probably one of my favorite pictures to describe the overhead myth. Hopefully it's large enough, but it's a little comic. At top it says, charity declares 100% of your donation goes straight to the cause. And it has a bunch of pandas with a pile of cash, with one asking, now what? And the other one shrugging. If we want nonprofits to really serve their mission and actually get the outcomes that we want to see, they really need to provide and invest in themselves, create the infrastructure to create the reality of their mission. We can't just, put put all the money in the program and call it a day, because we're not going to get the outcomes that we need and we want. And we're just causing a disservice to the general community that we're trying to serve. So in the overhead myth, it is starting to turn. There was a letter by a lot of the charity watchdogs issued back, I think, in 2014. There's a lot of movement pushing back on us now. It will take time, but hopefully we're making progress that overhead will no longer be the end all be all on how we measure nonprofits, and we look for other avenues. So with that, I'm going to pass it up to Lauren.
All right, thank you, Adam and April. So I'm going to take kind of a little bit different spin on the overhead myth and actually talk about some ways that we can advocate and start to dispel that myth and start to move forward with not necessarily relying on arbitrary percentages to value an organization and their mission and their work. And one way we dispel myths is to ensure that we're maintaining the public's trust. And when I say the public's trust, what I really mean is, for the most part, nonprofits operate from taxpayer dollars through grants, government grants, right, or donor dollars. And so the vast majority of a nonprofit's revenue is either tax or public dollars. And so we must make sure that we are running our programs efficiently and effectively so that the donors trust that we're using each and every dollar to the advantage of our communities and the missions that we serve, right? So as April showed us so very clearly with her chart, right, the overhead cost greatly varies from nonprofit to nonprofit. And our watchdog organizations often have kind of this random percentage of overhead that's considered best practice, but doesn't actually consider the uniqueness of each organization and the need to invest in infrastructure now more than ever to continue to grow. And a nonprofit always wants to be in a position of growth. And I'm not talking about getting bigger per se, but growth in terms of continuing to modify your mission, your programs, your services to meet the ever-changing needs of the communities that you serve, right? So just remember, one size does not fit all when it comes to that overhead percentage. Again, April showed that very, very clearly. Investing in your organization, whether it be talented people, technology, or other resources, it's vital. It's vital for the advancement of the mission, and like I said, to continue to support our communities and to sustain the organization. If you are not in a growth position, then that means you are either stagnant or you're actually declining. So that's something that executives really need to consider in their strategic planning processes. And I also say it is a very unrealistic expectations that organizations should have low overhead costs. It creates this vicious cycle that Adam talked about. One of the ways we build trust with our funders, our donors, our grantors is through transparency. And I think this is the best way to advocate with your organization, for your organization. So actually having a conversation with your funders about the realistic cost to pursue your mission, the need to purchase technology, again, now more than ever, to move forward. And when you start purchasing technology, that means now you have to purchase cyber liability insurance, which is just another overhead cost, right? So it is really important to actually call your funders and say, listen, this is why my ratios look like they did. I just went through a technology revamp, and it's going to be a one-time bump up in our overhead costs, and then it'll stabilize, right? Have those conversations with your funders and grantors. They actually want to learn and hear from you. Next slide. So very much like Adam, this is kind of my take on the nonprofit starvation cycle. Again, it's worth repeating because this is exactly what's happening to organizations, and this is partly to blame for the disintegration of many organizations, right? So there's this unrealistic expectation about the overhead, pressure to conform, right? So I'm not going to spend money on the infrastructure of my organization. So we're going to underinvest in infrastructure due to the lack of the resources that we're not getting from our funders, our declining capacity to achieve outcomes, our declining capacity to serve people, and then your reduced capacity actually sets you up to be an organization that funders don't want to fund, right? Because you don't have organizational capacity. And it just goes on and on and on. So, I'm just piggybacking on Adam because I think it's worth repeating. Again, one way to do this is to work directly with your funders to just demonstrate that an investment in the infrastructure of your organization will actually result in greater capacity to serve your mission, higher quality programs, and our communities will be much better off. So, next slide, Alex. So, nope, that's it. So there is some good news, right? The belief that overhead is bad, it is actually changing according to the National Council on Nonprofits. They have written papers and have done research that demonstrate that costs, overhead, especially overhead costs, do not necessarily have a direct relationship to the effectiveness of the nonprofit. Actually, if overhead is too low, that's more of a concern, right? It shows a lack of investment in infrastructure and a lack of capacity. And nonprofits' impact on their communities and the effectiveness of their programs is a much better measure, right? So if you're not already creating kind of KPIs or measurements about your programs, and I'm talking about what is your impact? How many people are you serving? Are you serving broadly or deeply? You should start to create those measures and use that to demonstrate how effective your nonprofit is, as opposed to these artificial percentages of overhead costs. Nonprofit leaders and grant makers understand the reality that these costs are essential to advancing the mission of the organization and are now starting to rethink the overhead myth. It's really important to make the case for this investment with grantors and funders, and I can't say this enough. Communicate, communicate, communicate. The power is shifting, right? I grew up, writing grants to grantors and always thought, well, the grantor had all of the power, all the decision-making about the money that they gave me and how I can use it, right? Now, grantors are starting to say, well, we want to have a dialogue. We want to discuss, how the money is best used for your organization. And so that needle is starting to move. It's also really important for nonprofits to be transparent about the finances and the outcomes of the organization's activities, right? Again, to maintain the trust, you've got to be honest and realistic about the true cost to run your organization. And make sure that the finance reports are a true reflection. If you have a year where there's a lot of overhead, you can very simply say, we are investing in our organization. And I think that funders are starting to hear that. I think it is dangerous to not be transparent and truthful about your reporting. It can really set you up for a bad path. All right. So some good trends in funding. Funders and grantors are kind of embracing the idea of investing in the infrastructure of an organization and then increasing allowable overhead costs. This will promote the sustainability and growth of the organization. So as an example, two really kind of big trends right now: trust-based philanthropy, which is unrestricted multi-year funding, and community-based funding, which is using the community's natural resources and voices to address the challenges and to improve the quality of life in a community. At a recent conference I attended for the Council of New Jersey Grant Makers, they had a panel of several very large funders in New Jersey. I think it was the Victoria Fund, FM Kirby, and the Provident Bank Foundation, among others. And the whole panel talked about these funders, these grantors, moving towards trust-based philanthropy, understanding that funding is a conversation between the funder or the grantor and the grantee, and that there's a collaborative process, and there's trust that the organization knows what they're doing, but two, the best use of those funds, even if that means that a large portion of those funds goes towards overhead to build capacity. There are also capacity building grants out there that you can seek out, and the whole point of those grants is to invest in technology and people and other resources to position your organization to be sustainable and to grow. So both of these funding models do the following. Like I said, they shift the power to the organization, and it allows the grantee to be part of the decision-making process. The funders are more interested in funding for impact to communities than just managing overhead costs. The funders work directly with the organization to understand the full range of costs that every organization has. And I will tell you, if you go back to Adam's slide about the study and that the most effective organizations had 32 to 36% overhead, a typical for-profit business has overhead at 32 to 36%, right? So it only makes sense. And these funders are less about economics and more about creating equity in our communities and our society. So, couple takeaways. Always, always, always position your organization to build capacity. And the only way you can do that is to invest in infrastructure. And support capacity building by investing. Communicate and be transparent with your funders. They really do want to hear from you. And finally, cultivate, cultivate, cultivate. Cultivate your donors, cultivate your funders. Let them see your programs, let them see how you operate so they can understand, one, the cost, but two, the need to continue to build capacity. That's all I had.
Thank you so much, Lauren. Thank you, Adam. So we do have a few questions here from our audience. One of them is, how do you address donors' concerns? If they look at your financial statements and they have questions about that overhead number, what's one of the key ways that we can address a donor's concern?
So I'll start. Again, I think one of the best ways to do that is to actually have a sit down with a donor, invite them to your programs, give them a tour, and then just go through it and say, this is why, our finances look like this. We purchased a series of new computers. We got new software so that we can be more efficient in our program reporting, right? Again, I think it's all about transparency, and when you have transparency, then you build trust. And when you build trust, then you can kind of dispel that myth, but also have your funder be more interested in continuing their funding cycles.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I just have to add to that, telling the story of a nonprofit is probably the most important thing. That storytelling to the donor, explaining what the nonprofit is doing, the impact they're providing to the community. That's really most important right now to kind of dispel those myths about overhead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. So we've gotten some questions about, can we get a copy of the presentation? So yes, this is being recorded, so you will be able to get a copy of the presentation in the upcoming days. If you had registered for the event, you'll be able to get this recording. There's also another question in terms of not-for-profit F in that comparison chart that we had. It says, if the school funds for grants, wouldn't fundraising have some percentage allocated instead of being zero? Asking because this is most similar to our organization in terms of grant funding. So there are some definitions, I think, around what would be considered fundraising and what would be included in that fundraising category, but I don't necessarily think that all schools are fundraising because it depends on the type of school. If you're an independent school that just serves the general population, or a school that's serving an underserved population or a low-income population, those grants are usually a little more set, and I think you're not doing as much fundraising for those grants for low-income students. So I think, again, it really depends on the school and its business model and where the funding is coming from for the population.
Yeah, just add to that, because I know what a nonprofit that one is. That those grants, it's more fee for service, so it's kind of more attached to the children who are attending, as from low income standpoint. It's not really going out to solicit the funding. It's more automatic to them. It's not really going out and fundraising for it.
And another key thing to keep in mind, one thing that we don't show you on that chart is those not-for-profits bottom line and their net income. So that is one thing that's not there. So I would imagine that if there was a shortfall in the grants and they were not enough to cover the expenses, the organizations, yes, would have to do more fundraising to be able to break even, or to be able to build reserves and to be able to be profitable, to continue the mission and continue to serve people. So that's where every organization is going to have a different business model. Some are going to fundraise more than others. In terms of the fundraising, there also is accounting guidance that if you were to have a gala or you were to have a fundraising event, any of those direct benefits to a donor can be shown net with the revenue. So that's also a little bit of a key piece as to why the fundraising number gets to be a little lower than it might have been, because you can net those donor received benefits with the revenue. So if you were to have a gala and the ticket per person is $100 per person is the donor received benefit for their meal and for their plate at the gala. That can be net on the revenue on the statement of activities. So I think that sometimes contributes to the fundraising number being a little low. That's consistent also with the 990 presentation. For the financial statements, you don't have to, that's an option. So something to keep in mind. With allocating fundraising and development staff, somebody asked if we could allocate fundraising and development staff to the program it asks funding for. I think there's still going to be some parameters around what's considered a fundraising expense, even though it's supporting your programs. I don't know if I would necessarily allocate that to program costs.
Usually when you're talking about program, you're talking about the direct program benefit cost, not getting the money for the program itself, the direct cost for the program.
Yeah. And, you know, the fundraising and development staff is still supporting the programs. Remember, fundraising and G&A are supporting activities to the mission and the program and the organization. Someone also wanted to contribute here with a comment that the court issue in communicating is the term nonprofit. There is no such thing. Nonprofit is simply a tax status, and I fully agree. Has the AICPA given any thought to even changing the terminology of nonprofit in their guidance to something like charitable organization?
I mean, they do refer to them as charitable organizations and things of that nature, but nonprofit is so stuck in the public's mind. I don't think we're ever gonna really get away from that. But you know, not-for-profits are allowed to have profits. The only difference is those profits aren't going back to the owners. They're staying within the nonprofit. That's really the biggest difference between the two, besides paying taxes. But
yeah, it's true. You know, we often say that just because you're a nonprofit doesn't mean you can't generate a profit, because you want to have reserves for a rainy day. You know, that rainy day came with the COVID pandemic, and some organizations had better reserves than others. So you are tax exempt organizations because of where your money comes from. It doesn't mean that you can't generate a profit. So yeah, I agree there. Let's see. And this one too for Lauren. Is there anything else you see that not-for-profits should be doing when it comes to communicating to donors, communicating to grantors, anything else they should be doing in terms of annual reports?
Yeah, so I would say two things. For your existing donors, again, be them grantors or foundations or state, right? Make sure that there are several points of contact throughout the year. They want to hear from you. They want to know kind of what you're up to. So always send your annual report. And of course, the acknowledgement letter that you send when you receive some kind of funding. Send an invitation to attend an event, a personal tour, right? I think several points of contact throughout the year, keeping that donor, that funder engaged, again, only brings awareness to the value of your services and your mission, but also starts to create awareness around what it really takes to pursue your mission. So, you know, again, cultivation. Steward those dollars, right? Send pictures, like literally send pictures of what the donor's dollars did. You know, did it buy a thing? Did it provide a service to a child? One of the most heartwarming things you can do is if your programs serve a population, find a way for that population to send some kind of thank you letter or acknowledgement. I once worked with a daycare center, and we would often get all the kids together in a little circle, and they would hold up a thank you sign. We'd take a picture and send that to the donor. And the donors just really so appreciated that. So it really is about cultivation. The other thing I would say is, and I've heard this from many grantors, is when you are getting ready to apply for a new grant or investigate a new funder, call them first. Don't be afraid. They want to hear from you. Call them and talk to them about your organization and discuss how your needs meet their philanthropic priorities. That initial phone call will go a long way in creating a lasting relationship.
Mm-hmm. And Lauren has many years of experience working in nonprofit organizations. So she's coming from a different perspective than Adam and I would. You know, Adam and I really specialize in the audit side. We're the ones looking at this functional expense schedule for nonprofits, seeing if it complies with the guidance, reviewing that methodology. Lauren's worked with nonprofits for a number of years. So she really speaks from experience in terms of discussing this overhead number and how to portray your mission and your organization to donors.
She's not an accountant.
And I always say I've survived overhead. So, yeah.
And Adam feels really passionate about the overhead myth. Adam, you wrote an article, right?
I did. Back in December, I wrote an article about the overhead myth and dispelling that myth and all that good stuff.
So if anybody wanted more information too on Adam's article with the overhead myth, it is up on the SACS website under our not-for-profit section, under our resources there for nonprofit organizations. Okay, well, thank you, Lauren. Thank you, Adam. Our contact information is here for you. If you have any other questions, reach out to us anytime. I'm going to leave you with one other note because we're just getting to the end of our 1 hour. Thank you again for joining us. But a little bit about what's new at SACS, what's going on. We have our Founders Award coming up. Our Founders Award is where we give a nonprofit a chance to win the first place prize of $20,000 unrestricted to be used for whatever you need. We're really excited about it. We've been doing it for about 5 years now. It's on a theme. So the theme is accessibility. We ask that you submit a 5-minute video And so all of the organizations that apply have a chance to win, and we do an award breakfast ceremony where we really gather everybody in the room to recognize all the nonprofits for all the work that they do. It's a really great event. I encourage you to apply. If you have any questions, we have a Q&A seminar coming up in a few weeks, I believe on July 11th. I'm happy to answer any more questions you have about the Founders Award. You can find out more on our SACS website under our not-for-profit section. You will find information about our Founders Award, and you would be able to download the application package right there on our website. So thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you really enjoyed learning more about the functional expense schedule for nonprofits, the overhead myth, and how you can better communicate your mission and your organization to all of your donors and funders. So thank you everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.